All right, everybody. So I'm just going to cover the remaining 5 minutes, roughly speaking, of lecture 6, which we ran out of time of covering. So remember, we were talking about data frames. So what we need to do is to talk about how do we group by and additional operations for data groups, for data frames. So the idea of behind grouping is actually to be able to aggregate data that is contained in a data frame. For example, the first thing we want to group by, remember the hit albums, we want to group by the artist. If I run this current code right here, what you see is that I'm going to group by the first by a column that is called artist. So that means that any records or any rows of my data that share the same artist is going to be grouped together. So one way to look at this is if you look at the record Michael Jackson, what this says is that once I did the grouping, all the row 0, row 10, 16, 65, 66 are sort of the album that are all created by Michael Jackson, and they are grouped together. So they are in another way corresponding to keys or indices that correspond to Michael Jackson. Once we have created those groups by doing the command dot groups, we can now operate on them. So for example, I can do dot sum, which is looking at, and then do head 10, which is looking at the top 10 of those file. If I do this, what it actually does is I remember my record is hit albums. And this is saying that, well, I'm going to look at the artist ABBA and what is accumulated sales and accumulated claim sales, okay? And then this is displaying the top 10, the first 10 records of it. So the next thing, of course, is you can sort, right? You can sort based on the certified sales and in a descending order. If you look at this line, it's descending, ascending equal to 4, so it's descending order. So you can actually see this is at the top 5 artists with the largest certified sales. For example, Michael Jackson has the largest certified sale of accumulated to be 123 million. You can also do count, right, as this particular comment here. And then again, based on, and then, you can also do count. Of course, this is not displayed any, no, there's no displaying, but then I can sort of query what I have counted. So what this does is to say, well, tell me how many albums that is made it to my hit list. For example, Michael Jackson has 5, some Madonna has 3, and so on. So you can also use this aggregation function, AGG, which basically you can pass through this function to perform additional operations. For example, in this particular case, I would like it to do sum to apply to my group. So again, this does the same thing as before, which we achieved by using this dot sum operation. Instead, we say we are going to apply the AGG function, which is more generic, that it's basically take an input as a particular type of function. In this case, happen to be the sum function to achieve the same result. So now this .agg is a lot more flexible in a way that you can provide any type of function that operate over the data in my data frame. So this is a very first example you're going to see, which is a lambda function. So a lambda function in here is an inline function that where I'm highlighted is actually what the function do. So what if you actually just forget about the outside of the parentheses, only focus on what the highlighted part, this is how we have defined a lambda expression. And if you actually interpret this, what it does, it says, well, for each of the cell in my record, I'm going to multiply it by 1,000,000. So it translates sort of numbers in millions to the actual dollar, and then sum them together. Okay, so that's what it does. And if we run this, oops, of course, if you run this, you see that every single cell is before they are in sort of millions unit, but now they are actually in dollar unit. So they are actually, each of them is multiplied. So this is described as this lambda expression that describe a particular function that operate on the data. So lambda expression is usually used to define a function in line, and you don't necessarily have to give it a name. So, so this is another example of a simple lambda function. So I'm going to define a lambda function which takes two input A and B, and then it's going to return output, which is A plus B. But I can give it to a name, right? So in this particular case, I'm going to say this particular thing, we can assign a variable add, which is my lambda function. So of course, now add is now the name of my lambda function, so I can actually provide this two input. So if I put 2 and 3 as my function input, it's going to call this function lambda and returns 5. Oh, of course, I want to let's execute this code first, of course, and then we can run this. Okay. Now, if you look at this particular expression, this is an expression which is list comprehension. All right, so if we go back to the lambda inline lambda function here, this is in the interior of this function is really a list comprehension, which is tell me how do I operate over each cell in the row. Okay. And finally, if you don't want to use lambda function, you can kind of do aggregate by taking an input of an actual real function, and then the real function, this is sum of and multiplied by a million, is precisely what the previous lambda function is trying to do, except that you will have a slightly longer piece of code, right? In this particular case, you need to define what this function does, and you know, it takes a row in my data frame, and for each cell in the row, I'm going to multiply it by a million, and then I'm going to sum it up and return the summed value. So if I execute this, this is going to give the exactly same result as before, except my code is much longer. And finally, we're going to just touch base over a little bit of built-in plotting. In this particular case, we're going to use matplotlib. Again, this is a particular library that has a bunch of plotting plotting capabilities. Okay, so let's call the plot. So this particular case that I have have the data we have before, which is heat album that contains certified sales and claim sales. And then this is actually plotting each of those columns in sort of line plots. Okay. But also I only need to maybe select just one column to plot. The top is plotting 2 columns. This is plotting 1 column. And if I do this, I'm just plotting, you know, plotting one of those columns, which is certified sales. We can also do bar chart. So in this particular case, we provide a parameter here to say the kind is a bar, meaning I would like to see bar chart. If I don't provide anything, it's a line chart. So in this particular case, I can do our bar chart, and that's what it looks like. Okay. So again, it's selecting 2 columns, the certified sales and claim sales, one in red and one in blue. Okay. So you can also do what's called a scatter plot, and a scatter plot is plotting a data point where the x-axis is a certified sale and y-axis is a claim sale. Okay, and then this is done by doing dot plot scatter, which means I'm going to do a scatter plot. And if I do this, I'm going to see for all those records in my that I care about, x-axis is certified, y-axis is claim, and each data point corresponding to a record in the hit album. And also finally, as you see in the homework, we also have histograms, and this is one easier way to plot histograms. So number of pings and number of, and then the step size. And you can see, this plotting right here. Okay, so that's it for the remaining of lecture 6. Please feel free to use office hours or Piazza to ask your questions. And finally, Happy Lunar New Year.